So we got a good one today. Hard sayings of Christ. We got a good one. This is one of those that you wonder, what is Jesus talking about? Good grief! I mean, we assume that obviously Jesus is speaking somewhat symbolically here, right? But at the same time, we also know that there are people that do not believe that Jesus said anything symbolically. But it's interesting that as I was doing my research for this, I found out that as far as we know, only one person in history, Christian in history, has actually cut off their hand because of this verse. And it was an early bishop named Origen. And he wanted to be sure that he didn't go to hell, so he cut his hand off. Now, that's the story, okay? There were all kinds of stories about these early Christian bishops. But as far as we know, no one else has plucked out their eye or cut off their hand, which is good news because we don't think that's really what Christ meant. So here it is. It's Matthew 5:29 through 30. And I'll read the verse. We'll have a quick prayer, and then we'll start talking about the passage, okay? Everybody have this who need it today? Everybody have this? Okay. I have more up here if you need it. Right there. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That's a violent image, isn't it? Tear it out. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Well, there's quite a few problems that we might have with this passage, isn't it? So is it any surprise that we might call this one of the difficult sayings of Christ? Of course, again, because of our willingness to be interpretive, I mean, it comes second nature for we who are Presbyterian and Reformed to think critically about what Jesus is saying, to apply this in a critical way, to say, well, of course he doesn't mean cut off your hand or tear out your eye. But as I said, if you're in the fundamentalist tradition, obviously they deal with it interpretively as well, because I don't see them going around with a lot of hands cut off and a lot of eyes pulled out. They don't do that. So somehow, this is naturally interpreted as being metaphorical or having something more meaning than literal. So, I'm not even going to state the problem with the passage because it's kind of obvious. Okay. Another problem with the passage, besides the fact that it's self-mutilating, and the passage that is rather violently self-mutilating, is that what does it mean? What does it mean? Now understand, this passage, we're going to see this in a few minutes, is this saying of Christ is restated very differently in the other Gospels. Okay? Here, it's very unique, the way it's written here in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. It's very unique, which is why I chose it. In the others, it's less, well, you'll see what I mean. It's a little more general, okay? But here, it's very, very specific. So, obviously, the first question we want to ask, and I'm looking at number 2, is, are these verses metaphorical? Well, just about every biblical scholar has said, well, obviously they are, because Jesus clearly isn't talking about literal self-mutilation. But another scholar has said, well, there was mutilation in the time of Christ. And there is at least one verse pointing toward punitive mutilation in the Old Testament. Now, we know, I had a friend when I was a teacher, when I got back from the Peace Corps, and I was teaching, saving money to go to seminary. I was teaching students from all over the world, and some of my students were from the Middle East. Some were Islamic, they were Saudi Arabians. And I had a real good friend, Ibrahim. I got to know him really well. He was a sharp person, a very good guy. And I, and he came over to our house for dinner one night. This was when I was living with my parents. And he came over, and we started talking about their laws, the laws in Saudi Arabia, how strict they are. And I'll never forget, this is exactly the way he said it to me. He said, Mac, if you steal one time, no. That's what they say. If you steal, he said, the second time, no. If you steal the third time, he went, like that. And I went, oh, So mutilation as punishment is still, at least in Saudi Arabia, it's still practiced. Possibly in other parts of the world. And it was, at least to some degree, it certainly was a part of pagan culture in the time of Christ. It was a part of pagan culture. We don't hear of Roman culture. They would, they would cut off heads, but that was generally capital punishment. You didn't ever really hear much in Roman culture, unless somebody can correct me, of cutting off limbs or hands. I've never heard of pulling out eyes, except in Greek mythology. So but there was, as you see under number 1, punitive mutilation in the time of Christ. And this is from Deuteronomy. If men get into a fight with one another, and the wife of one intervenes to rescue her husband from the grip of his opponent by reaching out and seizing his genitals, you shall cut off her hand. Show no pity. Wow. Did you know that was in Deuteronomy? I didn't either. And there it is. So there's all kind of little laws in there that we go, whoa, this is really interesting, Okay, what's the reason for a law like that? Well, because what was God's number? Be fruitful and multiply, right? And how does one be fruitful and multiply? With sexual organs. So that the possibility of cutting someone off from being able to have babies is a capital punishment. Okay? That's what that is all about. But that's the only example that we can find in the Old Testament of punitive mutilation. And in fact, if you'll go to the next part, number 2, you will find that self-mutilation in the Old Testament is considered a pagan practice and is absolutely forbidden. It says, as you can see, you are children of the Lord your God. You must not lacerate yourselves or shave your forelocks for the dead. Well, now we see this type of action today, don't we? In some cultures where grieving is expressed by self-flagellation.
Is that where the prohibition against tattooing is?
Against what?
Tattooing?
Probably not. No, they didn't consider tattooing self-mutilation. Tattooing was associated with prostitution. Yeah. But it wasn't self-mutilation. Yes. Yeah. If you see accurate historical movies, this is also during the time of Christ. You will see that if they depict someone like Mary Magdalene, who by the way was probably not a prostitute, but if they depict her, she'll have tattoos on her. And so that was more associated with prostitution. That was not considered mutilation, okay, at that time. Mutilation would have been literally the flagellation, cutting the skin, something like that. Yeah, that would have been. And so grief rituals. Jewish grief rituals do not involve any self-flagellation whatsoever. Never have. It could have, though, because in the culture of the Old Testament, they were surrounded by cultures that did self-flagellate. That did that as a part of their grief. Now, the closest that the ancient Jews would come to that would be the donning of sackcloth and ashes, where they would symbolically put on the sackcloth, pour ashes on them, but that's not mutilation. So that's as close as we can come to anything that's spoken about in the Bible at all, except for what Jesus seems to be saying here about self-mutilation. And clearly it is it is forbidden. In fact, as you look down there at B below, Hellenistic, which of course that's the Greek influence culture, and rabbinic literature exaggerated demands to cut off limbs from the body as a sign of seriousness about morality. But notice they were exaggerated demands. In other words, they were used in sermons or in writings as not a literal instruction, but as a means of showing the extreme importance of what they were saying. This is so important that you need to be willing to cut your arm off in order to do this, to obey this. So they would use these type of literary images, and they weren't, of course, meant ever to be taken literally. Now, I told you a while ago that the passage as it appears in the other Gospels, in Mark and in Luke, are somewhat different. So let's take a look at the Markan passage, the one in Mark, and let's talk a little bit about the difference, okay? Let's read this. This is Mark 9, 42 through 48. Let's look at the differences between this and the Matthew passage in the bold. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell, where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. What differences do you see between this passage and the Matthew passage? There's a few details that are different.
Rhetorical.
What are the rhetorical differences? Take a look. There are some rhetorical differences here.
Well, it does say what will happen if you do one or the other. If you keep your hand or your eye, you go to hell with 2 eyes.
But look, what specific hand or eye in Matthew? What specific hand? What?
The left eye. And those aren't.
If your right eye, and notice that in Mark, they don't specify the right eye or the right hand. Okay? So the question is, why does the Matthew passage specify right eye and right hand? And also, interestingly, the Mark passage adds another body part. What part is that? The foot. The foot. Which doesn't appear in the Matthew passage. All right? Why is that so? Is there a reason for that? Now that may sound like, oh, does it matter? Well, yeah, when you're doing biblical studies, it matters. We want to find out what the context is of this specific passage that Jesus is using. And so that's why we look at these differences. That's really the main difference between the 2 passages. The eye and the hand is specifically the right in Matthew, and then you add the foot in Mark. Now, specifying in the Matthew passage, the right hand makes sense. What do you know about the right hand? Yes. That was what they ate with, but what in biblical imagery is special about the right hand? What does the right hand of the Lord mean? Go ahead, anybody. What does the right hand of the Lord mean? Huh?
Best spot.
Best spot. That's right. That's right. If you sat around a table at a Passover, who would the host seat at the right hand?
Okay.
The most special guest. And isn't it interesting that at the Lord's Supper, Judas was seated at the right hand of Christ? That's really interesting, by the way. The right hand. Judas was right there beside him. So that's really kind of interesting. But anyway, so the right hand, we think of the right hand of God. We think of the right hand has a special meaning as the hand that you use. And obviously they were left-handed people. So it wasn't really that kind of physical separation. But it was more an imagery of the chosen The chosen are on the right hand of God. And Jesus uses that image in Matthew 25, when on the day of judgment, those, people will be separated from Jesus, some at the right and some at the left. And it's a long passage, a vision of the kingdom of judgment. But you'll see that right and left imagery being used, a separation, okay? So, but now, that right hand kind of makes sense, but the right eye doesn't make sense. You never hear anything about the right eye. Because, why? Because both eyes are needed equally. Both eyes, they do the same. The right hand had special purposes in that culture. Still does in cultures today. But the eyes, there's no specification. So it's more or less what, according to my research, shows that using the right eye is simply a literary device to match in with the right hand. In other words, it made sense to say right hand, right eye. It gave it completion, okay? But the right eye really, in this case, besides the fact it was an eye, had no real special significance. The right hand did. The right hand did, yes.
Well, I think of a couple of things. One, I think in Middle Eastern culture especially, the left hand was used to clean yourself after bodily functions.
Correct.
So
Correct.
the right hand was the one that you ate with. And,
Correct.
but I was thinking of Stephen before the Sanhedrin and giving his testimony. At the very end, he says they drug him out to stone him, and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God.
Right.
And so
Right.
as you were pointing out in Matthew 25 and other places, the right hand of God was the position of favor.
Yes.
And so to remove that right hand had a powerful image.
Yeah. It is better to give sacrifice standing than to lose your salvation. So what Jesus is doing here is lifting up salvation above everything else. And you have to be willing to give up things in order to obtain the kingdom of God. Okay? We'll see that as we broaden the context of the passage itself. Exactly. So losing the right hand, one in that culture, and still in some cultures, would suffer greatly because of that. I mean, beyond the fact they've lost a hand. But losing the right eye really did not have that kind of significance. Just want to point that out. Kind of different. Okay, let's look at the word study a little bit. The phrase, if your right eye causes you to sin. Causes you to sin in the Greek is scandalizo. What word comes from that in English? Scandalize, scandal, right? But it really means a stumbling, like a stumbling block. A stumbling which deflects a person from the path of God's will and salvation. Now, that word scandalizo is used in many different contexts and many different places. And the stumbling implies this stumbling, though, is different from the other uses. Because in the others, it's a stumbling where a person could be restored back to the right relationship with Jesus or the right relationship with God. The disciples were described as stumbling when they kind of fled Jesus at the crucifixion. The word that was used was stumbling. They stumbled. But it has greater implications in a couple of the passages as kind of a word for final judgment, as a loss of salvation. And if you look at back at the next page, you'll see Matthew 18, 6 through 7. An interesting passage. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come, but woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. You know, it's interesting how much I heard this passage quoted this week in regards to what's going on at the border. Right? Right? But here's what's interesting about that. The actual better passage to use, if you're going to use a Christian or biblical image or passage for that, it would be better to use suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. The little ones in this passage, the mikroi, the word is mikroi in Greek, can also be applied to new disciples. New disciples. And Jesus is speaking to his disciples when he says this. And so it seems that there was some discord between the disciples among themselves. We know there was, about which one was the greater of the, who's the real leader. So some say that mikroi here, mikroi can also mean not just new disciples, it can mean marginalized people, the poor, the hungry, those who are in need. It can mean that as well. So mikroi is a big word. Paidon in Greek is children. And when Jesus wants to specifically speak of children, as in suffer the little children to come unto me, he uses paidon. Here in this passage, he uses mikroi, a totally different implication of that. So I think Jesus means something different in the context of that passage. But and I'm not saying, I'm just being a smart aleck Bible scholar, okay? Showing off that I actually did study Greek once upon a time. But anyway, the stumbling block is what we're focusing on. And so our passage translates it, or at least in the NRSV, translate that as causes you to sin. Something that causes you to sin. But in this case, the results are eternal. You lose your salvation. And that's kind of rare for that word to be used in that context. But it is. Another word is hell, Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom. How do we think of hell today?
Fire and brimstone.
Well, no, today, how do we think of hell in the Reformed Christian Church? I mean, fire and brimstone's okay.
That's all I remember.
That's all you ever heard, correct? No, I'm not saying you're not right. I'm saying that it's a concept we struggle with.
Separation from God.
Separation from God is one image. Any others? Any others? Separation from God? Or some scholars say it's just metaphor. That hell is meant to be more poetic than real. Okay? And it's also interesting with, right now we're seeing a lot of language about hell. I mean, seriously, on the internet in regards to things that are happening, and these people are going to burn in hell. And it's really, I mean, it's for folks who really are saying we hope there is a hell.
And a lot of the populace thinks they're in hell.
Okay, very
Things
good.
that they're doing in the society the way it's prescribed.
Very good, very good. That's another view of it. Absolutely correct. But there really is a root for understanding the word hell. It's hot in here. Is the AC on? Okay, well, anyway. Yeah, they're fixing it. It's coming. There really is a root for the word hell. I got to watch my time. Oh yeah, we're doing fine. It's in hell. The word in Greek in hell is Gehenna, which literally translates as the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom was located outside the walls of Jerusalem. It was traditionally the place where, when the Canaanites were there before the children of Israel came to the Promised Land, that's where the Canaanites did human sacrifices. So as you can imagine, it had a very bad reputation. In fact, in Revelation, where the final battle of battles takes place, is in the Valley of Hinnom. It's an appropriate place for bloodshed, is what that image is. And it became somewhat of a huge image in ancient Israel. In other words, you would say, if you don't behave, young lady, young man, I'm going to send you to the Valley of Hinnom. Because it was like the scary place. It was the scary place, okay? So, in the time of Christ, the Valley of Hinnom was a garbage dump. It was a garbage dump. It was where all the refuse of the city was thrown. And they burned it. And it burned constantly. The fires were never out. They burned constantly. Because they were constantly dumping stuff into it. So the image of eternal fire is actually an image of the burning garbage dump. So another way to say hell is to say, you know, your body will be cast onto the garbage dump. So there's an image here that doesn't necessarily associate with eternal punishment as much as being just cast aside. Cast aside, okay? And so that's an interesting root of the word Gehenna, of the concept of hell. How do you feel about hell? What do you think about it? I'm opening this up. Do you think about hell very much? Why not? Shouldn't we be thinking about hell all the time? What do you think? Holocaust. Okay, good. I mean, we have images of hell on earth, don't we? I mean, I remember seeing those jackets worn by the veterans of Vietnam that said, I know I'm going to heaven because I served my time in hell. Right? Seen those before. Why do we not talk a lot about hell? Why?
I think that most, particularly in our tradition, that it's not a threat. We really don't, I mean, I don't do the right thing because I might go to hell. I do the right thing because I enjoy doing the right thing. It's a very negative way to instruct.
Yeah. I mean, it does definitely have that, you know. I mean, I guess the question that we struggle with in a Reformed tradition, I mean, believe me, Calvin, Luther, our spiritual ancestors, they talked about hell a lot. And they had a literal definition of it. They believed. And that's okay. It's okay to have that literal definition. Absolutely. But part of our belief in grace, yeah, go ahead, Bobby, go ahead.
I think that's feeding the wrong wolf.
Feeding the wrong wolf. Very good. Very good. Somebody actually listened to my sermon. Wow. Yeah, Will. Oh, give it. Yeah.
Our son, and I knew he was going straight to heaven because he had already been through hell. For 2 years he was in unremitting pain.
Yes. Yeah.
That was
That's hell. That's hell. Yeah, exactly. I mean, death can be a release. Death can be peace. We talk about resting in peace. I mean, and it can be a release. Absolutely. So yes. Will. Very good. Will.
Well, it's, I think that's a difficult subject, and it's not.
Yes, it is.
It's not easily set aside. Jesus spoke a lot about hell,
Mm-hmm.
and so I don't think it's something that we can easily cut out of the Bible. It certainly appears a lot in the Old Testament. And so there's a need, I think, for balance in our understanding. I know that some would dismiss it and say it doesn't exist, it's not a concern. And yet, I think in this balanced life we're trying to live, that we recognize that there is a hell, and it's something that we need to think about and maybe talk about and recognize, and yet at the same time be so grateful that we're not going to hell, and so our lives are full of gratitude because of what Christ has done for us.
And let me back you up on what you said. I mean, what you're hearing in the culture right now about, man, people are doing this. They deserve hell. I mean, in other words, there are times we want there to be a hell. Isn't there?
Yeah.
Because we cannot imagine. I mean, can you imagine sitting there in heaven beside Hitler? Or beside someone who would do something like that? I mean, that's it. We want there to be a hell because we cannot accept, that evil can dwell so close to good, or that there's no such thing as punishment for the horrible things that people do. And so yes, we find ourselves desiring that there be one. Now sometimes it's a revenge fantasy. It could be a revenge fantasy. They don't think like I do, so they're going to hell. And I've heard a lot of that language. But there are times when we just go, wow, evil is so, evil and God cannot dwell side by side. They cannot do it. And there has to be, to be in the arms of God, you can't be evil. So something has to change. And some people don't change. Some people are always evil and will always be evil. Yes, Jane?
Sometimes
sometimes in life I need to know the consequences, that there are, if I behave a certain way, if I lie or whatever, that there are consequences
Yeah.
for that behavior, whether it's a simple behavior, like saying a white lie, or it's a large behavior as murdering someone.
And Jesus taught using that language. He said, the road is narrow. The road is narrow. The road to hell, the Gehenna, is wide. The road is narrow for those who would follow me. So there clearly is when you are following Christ, it's not the ethic that saves you, but it's the ethic that comes forth from your faith that you follow. And you have to follow that. You have to. I mean, there's grace and forgiveness, but you have to follow it. Yeah.
That's the point of Jesus. If you're not with him in that mental state, you're in hell.
Exactly. Yeah. Or you're certainly on your way, right?
Yeah.
All right, let me finish up real quick because our time's almost done here. I want to run through the rest real quick, but it's real short, real easy to get through. So you'll see below the idea of hell. Note that the eye and the hands are disposable parts of the body. There can be loss without death. You can live without these. Jesus didn't say pull out your heart. He said separate yourself from things you can separate yourself from, that you don't have to have, as compared to what you could lose if you don't cut these things off. So let's go on down. Here's the expansion of the passage. Now we see why right hand and why right eye, why the foot is left off. Here it is. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, in the time of Christ, that word adultery had a very, very specific meaning, as it does throughout the Bible. A man, doesn't speak of women, a man, because of it was the men who had the power. They could divorce freely. They had the power, the law on their side to do terrible things to their families. A man who has sexual relations with another man's wife, very specifically. That's from Exodus 20:13. That's one of the 10 Commandments. So it has a very, very specific meaning, adultery does. So when we connect the eye to the, tear out your right eye to the idea of adultery, we get something like we see from Samuel about David. And here's the passage. Everybody with me? Everybody with me? See where I am on the sheet? It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. He saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to fetch her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. So the danger of looking lustfully at a woman is the subject of many Jewish sayings. Not just what Jesus had said here, but of rabbinical teaching, of many Jewish sayings. And so the idea of your eye connected with the sin of adultery and the disciplining. Of course, it's a matter of the heart, not the eye. But the point is, the eye is the window through which temptation comes. So here is cause and effect. Here is cause and effect, okay? And that's kind of the image that Jesus, a very familiar image from rabbinical teaching that Jesus is using here. So he connects this passage directly to the male act of adultery. The male act of adultery. Women could commit adultery, but the man was held responsible. Which is why when the woman caught in adultery is brought to Jesus, he goes, where are your accusers? Which would have included spouse of the one who committed adultery with her. That would have been one of the accusers. In other words, they weren't following the law. They were not following the law. That's why he asked that question. And by the way, if you read that passage really carefully, you suddenly discover this is a setup. And when Jesus says to her, go and sin no more, he might have been talking about adultery, but he also could have been talking about you lying to try to get to, in other words, you being used to lie against me. Because this is not the law that they followed. This was a setup against Jesus. So it's interesting there are different interpretations of that. So there has to be accusers, there has to be an injured party in the legality of adultery. And the male is held responsible. Even though the woman caught in adultery can be punished, the male is held primarily responsible. And the charge is brought by the one who's been offended, the wife of the male, because it destroys the family. So we see this direct connection, and then we see David. And then, so how do we understand this then in the context of what Jesus taught us about grace? Well, I picked this passage from Matthew 19 to kind of explain that. Then Jesus said to his disciples, we're going to be studying this one later too. Truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astounded and said, then who can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals it is impossible, but for God all things are possible. And of course, as we learn when we study it later, what it means is that their goal, they saw riches as a sign of God's blessing. So they're going, wait a minute, if the very thing we believe is God's blessing does not bless us, how can we be saved? Because that's a sign that we are saved. And Jesus said it's not up to you. In other words, your riches are not a sign of your blessing. It's up to God. And you can apply that right here to the same saying, that God is the one who judges. And that therefore, you should remove yourself from the cause of temptation. But the question would be asked, but everybody's tempted. Everybody's tempted, right? So with God, there's grace and salvation. But there is temptation. In other words, you don't have to pull your eye out or cut off your hand. So let's look finally at section 5, context and meaning. We have here the theme of what are our impediments to salvation. What's the stumbling blocks? What blocks us from living out our faith fully, from living out the life of the kingdom of God? Name some things that block us from doing it. Impediments. Yeah, Will.
Our culture's emphasis on materialism.
Very good. Very good. Name some other things. Excellent. Very good. Name some other things.
Anxiety.
Anxiety. Very good. Very excellent. Name some other things. Pride. Fantastic. Pride. Self-centeredness. Absolutely. Name some other things.
Fascination with time.
Now explain that a little bit, Tom. What do you mean by fascination with time?
People are so time-oriented these days, that they just forget about what really matters.
Living for the moment. Living for the moment. Or placing your faith in time rather than placing faith in time. Which, boy, that'll turn you around. You're going to find out real quick that one don't work. What other impediments to our living out our lives in the kingdom of God? What? Well, yeah. Well, that goes back to doubt. That goes back to doubt being thrown in front of us, or us being tempted to doubt. Doubt. Now, everybody doubts. I'm not saying that we all doubt. We have doubts. We struggle with doubts. But allowing our doubts to lead us from living the kingdom life to where it actually stops us from living out our faith. That doubt is there. Can you think of any other impediments to the kingdom life?
Just jobs and other obligations that,
Good. Distractions.
yeah.
Distractions. Very good. Yes, Will.
I think of serious loss of a career, loss of a spouse.
Good, good,
Loss
good.
of a child.
Yeah.
It can really challenge our faith.
It can challenge our faith, absolutely. It can, absolutely can, yes.
Laziness.
What?
Laziness.
Laziness, sure, absolutely. It's true.
TV.
TV, close enough, yeah. Certainly some TV.
Legalism.
Legalism, very good. What do you mean by legalism? Yeah, I'll expand that a little bit.
So, legalism, I think of it as you're so focused on following the law, you know, and thinking
Yes,
that you get all about the passion.
religion can be the biggest stumbling block to faith, can it? Is that not true?
Yeah.
Religion can be the biggest stumbling block. Hey, somebody's at the door. Avon calling. You got to be my age to know about Avon. Now they're still around, aren't they? So anyway, okay. So here's what I want to say in closing this up. This saying in the other Gospels takes it well beyond its application to just sexual temptation. So that's really important. That's really important. So even though it's more specific here, we can't take it literally in the sense of pulling eyes out and cutting hands off. Because in the other expressions of this saying, it's used as a much broader sense. It puts the foot in there as well. It's a much broader saying, and it's not connected to any one sin like adultery. Okay? Temporary loss, however painful, is preferable to the loss of one's salvation. Temporary loss. In other words, cutting ourselves off from things that are stumbling blocks to us. You know what I mean? Cutting yourself off from that, pushing it away. Yeah.
Another one I thought it was addiction.
What's that?
Addiction.
Addiction. And we need help with addiction. It's something that if we're going to cut ourselves off from, we have to have help with that. You know, absolutely, totally true. And so I closed up by saying, resisting sin is more than just a matter of will. It sometimes requires an action that sets the believer apart from the temptation. Think about that. Not just a matter of will. It means sometimes, because sometimes you just don't have the will. You just don't have the will. You have to actually set yourself apart. And anyone who, you know, if you work with troubled youth, you know, who have gotten caught up in gangs and gotten caught up in that type of criminal activity, the one thing that has to happen is you got to pull them out of that environment, and they cannot go back into that environment again. They have to be separated out of that environment. So, it's the idea not of cutting off limbs, but the idea of separating things that are pulling you away from living out the kingdom life. And Jesus is using exaggerated language, and of course we know that. But what I'm saying is that if we miss the point, we don't, you know, we miss the whole thing, which is what are the things that we need to cut ourselves off from that might be hindering our ability to live out the Christian life fully. And all of us have them. All of us have them, you know. One of the things that I think a lot of us are struggling with, I ran a little long, I don't care. That's one of my problems right there. I need to cut myself off like time off. Cutting off your watch, I would never do that. In fact, I may as well cut off the watch because I always do. So maybe it's a sin. Maybe I ought to be looking at the watch. But anyway, so these days there's a lot of imaginary anger. A lot of imaginary anger. You know what imaginary anger is? It's fantasizing about revenge. Fantasizing about, road rage is an example of imaginary anger. Now don't get me wrong, it gets acted out. But just what leads to the acting out is, instead of thinking, well, what has caused that person to do that? Or rather, I'm not going to respond to that person's anger. We start ruminating about the anger. And there are so many things that can lead to imaginary anger, but it's very destructive. It's extremely destructive, imaginary anger. And you have to find a way out of it. You have to find a way out of it, because it only leads down a frustrating path. And I would rather, I would try to imagine serenity and peace rather than anger. Imaginary peace that can lead to actual peace. Yeah.
Let's like when a driver cuts you off, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with you personally, but you personalize it.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, you know, they would have cut anybody off, my dad.
For sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
cut anybody off.
And the point is that it's that's the imaginary anger, taking it personally. Taking things personally that really, now there are times you can take things personally when someone says you're a jerk. You're welcome to take that personally, okay? Yeah, that's real, you know. But when you get mad about things that, you start imagining anger about things about which you really have no control over, or that belong to that person, that can lead to a lot of despair. That can lead to a lot of even physical sickness. And we have to be really careful about that. Because it's easy to have that kind of imaginary anger. You know? So you feel it, it's real, but it's built upon your imagination, what you're imagining, what you're ruminating on. Okay. Anyway, all right, so anyway, cutting ourselves off from these things, separating ourselves, and that it's better to lose that than to lose our when I say to lose our gift of grace, to lose our salvation. And Jesus made no hesitation for believers that, yeah, you can lose it. You can, we can reject God. We can say, forget it, God. I don't want nothing to do with you. And a lot of people have. A lot of people have. There's nothing new. So the idea of, which really stands against the idea of, oh no, once you're saved, you're always saved forever. Well, you can't just go out here running and doing what you want. Run around. Paul was really, really clear on that. You still have an obligation to live out the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ. You still have an obligation. You have an ethic. You can get forgiveness for your stumbles, but you can't embrace that which is causing you to stumble. You can't embrace it. You have to recognize that it is a stumbling block. And we can all think of stumbling blocks in our lives, right? We can think of things that cause us to stumble. And that's what this passage is inviting us to deal with. Okay, any other questions or comments before we shut it down? Let's have a word of prayer and we'll go on. Lord, bless and be with us as we go forth into the week. Keep us in your loving care. Thank you for all good gifts. And be with us in 2 weeks as we return again to continue this study. In your holy and gracious name we pray. Amen. No class next week. We're going to do the July 4th celebration. No class.